Maurice Nicoll, Psychological Commentaries, Volume 2, Birdlip, December 30, 1944, from the work that Maurice Nicoll did with George Gurdjieff. The cognitive power of emotions. Number one, the work says that emotions are cognitive. What do you understand about this? Well, let's give illustrations. Two, the work says that the emotional center, if it were purified from negative emotions, it would be clairvoyant. Could you try to explain what this means? And three, are negative emotions cognitive? One of the simplest illustrations of the cognitive aspect of emotions is the power of birds to build nest in the mating season. Here, the emotional state brings with it knowledge, which the bird does not otherwise possess. And when the emotional state vanishes, the maternal cycle is over. That is, of course, the emotional part of the instinctive center that is implicated, not the emotional center itself, which probably scarcely exists in birds. This is just as well, for the emotional part of the instinctive center can bear things and forget things better, in fact, completely. It cannot become negative. Otherwise, animal life would die. Animals, birds, do not return to Papa and Mama, and once the emotional moving state is over, with its wonderful cognition and the whole business is over. In the case of educated man, it's different, but in primitive, savage tribes, it's much the same. The emotional part of the instinctive center, when temporarily awake, has wonderful knowledge to transmit to moving center for a brief time. When the work says that the emotions have cognitive value, it means that there is a definite state of knowing something connected with a particular emotional state. We now take the emotional center itself to understand that there is a definite state of knowing and connected with us, with our emotions. Let us remember that knowing is not thinking. We can know a thing in different ways without thinking. We can know, for example, through our senses that it is a fine day and do not have to think it is. Or we can know that another person is unhappy, or we can know that something is true. It is particularly with knowing truth that emotional states are connected. When one is in a particular emotional state, one may know something that one cannot know in another state. One sees the truth of something, and then the emotional state changes, and one no longer sees that truth in that you saw before. This is especially the case when one passes from relatively simple emotions into definite negative emotions. Negative emotions can never see the truth that non-negative emotions can see. This explains a great deal in life. It explains why, when we become negative towards one another, we cannot see what we saw before. We cannot indeed see any truth about one another. I will quote one or two passages from your answers about seeing truth emotionally. One, I understand that by the work saying that emotions are cognitive, that one's knowing is of entirely different quality when mental center is reinforced by emotional center. For instance, mental center knows that our being is composed of many eyes, but supposing a man suddenly sees an eye which has tormented him all his life, and his emotional center is flooded with joy at the realization that it is an eye and not part of himself. His knowledge is lifted instantly beyond all intellectual theorizing. 2, in the work one may slowly receive knowledge of the idea, for instance, that man cannot do, and then one day, in a twinkling of an eye, one sees one's own mechanicalness and helplessness and sees that it is oneself who cannot do. That is the cognition of the emotional center. 3, in doing these replies to question, I have felt occasionally that one is tapping along with one's stick of one's mind. As a blind man taps his way on his stick, tapping away against some wall of knowledge and getting some sort of guiding response, and then suddenly one taps and gets no response. The wall has fallen away and one is faced with a void. It is no good thinking any further because one has nothing to think further with, and one's mind begins to go round and round in a circle. One leaves it. Then often, sometime later, with no further thought given to the question as far as one is aware, one finds suddenly that one knows something about it without knowing whence the knowledge came. Does intellectual center continue working in some part of itself without one being aware of it? Or when one's mind stops its tapping, can emotional center work? As regards to this last example and others to the same effect, I would say that when you put your thoughts together in order and think from the work from different sides, a moment often comes when all these efforts at thinking are joined together in a new meaning. This is the work of the emotional side of us. Whether the emotional part of the intellectual center or the emotional center itself does not matter here. When people only have confused and scattered ideas of the work, that is, when they do not work on the knowledge line of the work cannot act on them properly because they do not seek it by their own efforts to bring together the ideas of the work through any concentration of thought. You have all heard that it must be built up in the work in your minds first, and then it acts in as a new transmitting machine. Remember that this work is to make us think in a new way. If you really never make this effort with the work, it remains at a distance from you and only something on the blackboard. When it is said that the emotions are cognitive, it means that through certain feelings you know certain things. Ordinarily, people think the emotions are blind in regard to knowledge. The object of this work is to awaken the emotional center through changing the mental center. As it is, glued to the senses and the world, the mental center misleads the emotional center and cannot awaken it. When the tree of the work is planted in the mental center and the emotional center begins to recover itself to awaken, the work is not about life and not about the world, but about a certain way of thinking about life and the world. For this reason, the word misinterpreted or change of mental thinking is the first step necessary to restore the emotional thinking or the emotional center to its proper working and to its different forms of clairvoyance. As long as you think in the same way as you always think, as long as we do not think from the work ideas, from knowledge of the work, your emotional center will act as a rule from the way you think habitually or mechanically. This is one of the first secrets to grasp. The idea of the work, the ideas of the work are designed to awaken the emotional center. But if you think in terms of making internal accounts, if you think in the ordinary way, that is, from the senses, if you imbibe opinions of others only, the emotional center must remain practically dead. The mental key is of the wrong shape and cannot open the right emotions. I advise you all to think about the ray of creation and the side octave from the sun. As regards clairvoyance, this is a very big subject to discuss, and I will only make 2 comments. Clairvoyance is a certain kind of unusual cognition. It is really 2 kinds. One kind is knowing something about somebody or something entirely unconnected with oneself. And the other is knowing something about someone personally connected. Clairvoyance really means clear seeing. One can think of it as the cognitive, emotional seeing of the truth about something or someone. The emotional center in us, however, is only very rarely clairvoyant and usually in such a way, usually mixed in such a way, and is so often wrong that the results are useless. To purify it, the acquired negative part of the emotional center must be lessened in its power and not made to take the chief place in our emotional lives. Roughly speaking, as we are, it is central in us, particularly in regard to such inner life as we have and what sense in ourselves we have. The purification of the emotions begins the work on the self-emotions arising from the false personality. The impurity of the emotional states is largely due to pretense, to meritoriousness, to falseness, to all sorts of forms of showing off, to self-deception and insincerity. We have quite a wrong sense of ourselves, believing in our merit, believing that we cannot do from ourselves, that we are conscious, that we have will, and so on. All this makes the emotional life little short of disastrous. In fact, it could easily be said that it would be better if we could have our emotional life cut out altogether. I will quote several passages from your answers about the purification and clairvoyance of emotional center. 1, I have heard it said in the work that only essence can be clairvoyant, never personality. And young children are sometimes clairvoyant and lose this faculty when personality forms. 2, it is possible that emotional center with its finer hydrogens is capable, when purified from negative emotions, of transcending the laws of space and time, which is what clairvoyance appears to mean. Thus, at times, emotional center can visualize something happening at a distance, particularly if someone with whom it has a strong emotional connection is concerned. 3, if emotional center were purified, would one see one's life more as a whole, and with more understanding, with a sense of pattern of which the apparently is unrelated bits are a part? And since it would be then looking from a high level, would one see oneself as one looks against a high level of being and consciousness? Would the fact that emotional center was so far purified give one strength to bear it? 4, if emotional center were purified of negative emotions, would one be above the line of passing time from this level, would have insights into many things that are obscured and inexplicable at our present level? Time would be quite different. Events would exist together instead of as disjointed series, and many things apparently unconnected would be connected. The meaning of cause and effect would become a coherent whole. In such a state, one would be receptive to influences from higher centers, and I imagine one would see and understand things objectively and at their real value. 5, if the emotional center were purified of negative emotions and one ceased to be identified with oneself, one would be able to see more deeply into one's own life and into the lives of others. The center would then work with much higher hydrogens, and one would start to become conscious in higher centers. Let us now speak of the cognition of negative emotions. You must all understand that cognition means knowledge, and that you can have evil knowledge or good knowledge. Negative emotions have their own kind of knowledge, particularly in regard to how to hurt people and wound them. When you are in a negative state towards someone, you know as a rule how to hurt that person most and say wounding things. Negative emotions, which are acquired through imitation, form an extraordinary mess in the emotional center, which is born pure. Since all emotions have a cognitive value, even negative emotions have their own cognitive value, which enables you to see the worst side of everything. Suspicion, for example, is a negative emotion and is often clever. It is often wrong, but at the same time, it's right on its own level. Remember, it is always wrong. In fact, all negative emotions on their cognitive side are always wrong. They only see one side. When followed very much they lead to hell. That is, towards the moon, towards an inferior, a lower way of taking everything. Seeing only the evil and never seeing the good, interpreting everything on the lowest level is, as you know, called in the Gospels, the sin against the Holy Ghost. In the passage where Christ is said by the Pharisee to be healing people by means of the devil, Matthew 12:32, some people imagine that they do not see the worst side of things and pretend to a kind of goodness, a kind of pretense of being cheerful or optimistic about others, whereas all the time they really believe in what their negative emotions cognitively give them. It is quite a different thing to observe a cognition that comes from negative emotions about another person and actually not believe it as portraying the whole person. You must see the cognition that comes to you through your negative emotions and acknowledge its presence and then work against it. And this requires a lot of work and a lot of self-remembering. Pseudo-optimism, pseudo-cheerfulness is quite useless, and in fact only intensifies the power of negative emotions in the world. Each person, given his own negative emotions, as it were, with their cognitions, with their false knowledge, and each person, if he or she wishes to work, must in some way lighten the burden of the total fog of negative emotion existing in the world, which is governed by negative emotion. But they must do it genuinely and especially by seeing their own negative emotions and so forgiving others in the sense of completely canceling their debts. In every case, negative emotions can only see half-truths. For instance, a person who is negative and who reports what someone else said may actually report what a person said, but leave out one or two things that also leave out the way in which it was said, the intonation, and so on. So he or she makes a dark picture, a lie. You will remember, talks about lying and how the first form of lying is always putting things to your advantage, slightly twisting what happened, as when a person says, I says to her, she says to me, etc. Now, if a person is negative and therefore ungenerous, he or she may describe something that happened in regard to a person disliked and the result be truth in a sense, but half-truth. You know, it is said in ancient literature that devils are very clever and ingenuous, but they only know half-truths. Goodness always looks stupid in comparison with the cleverness of negative eyes that are lying. I wonder if you've ever noticed negative emotion in the faces around you. Notice the expression in their eyes and notice how they are only watching. Think for a moment from what they're watching and what they want to catch. Think of the collection of eyes that will make in your life album of incidents. Perhaps you all know that when you are negative and suspicious, everything that is said only pours oil in the fire. I remember when I once had to deal with some insane people who are wholly under the power of negative emotions and negative thinking. How the slightest movement I made was always interpreted in favor of their negative ideas and from which they instantly deduced all sorts of things that were partly true. Negative eyes are really insane eyes in us. A person in negative emotions always notices very quickly what you have neglected, but takes no cognizance of what you have done. In this respect, his negative emotions give him a certain cognition, often very deep and subtle, and yet always wrong. The curious thing is that negative emotions can find proof. And if you join all these proofs together, then you will be overpowered by life. You are really stitching together a pattern of life in which you eliminate everything that really goes against these proofs. And as you know quite well, you are ignoring the good side and simply holding on to the cognitions of the unpleasant side, which have their own truth. The result is you come under the truth only of negative emotions, And as I say, such truths are false because they do not take in all sides. Perhaps sometimes you may catch a glimpse of this side of your being, which is negative, and what it is making in you every day. It is not a good, but a very nasty little worm, a very tiresome little spoiled child, a most unpleasant thing to become aware of. People glorify negative states. They feel it is right to worry and be identified. However, this is not true. One must do one's best to climb out of this pit if possible. It is possible, but it is not possible if the work has no real essential hold over you, for otherwise you will be feeling justified in your negative and painful life emotions. And not only is this, but these negative emotions will feed you their own cognitive side so that you will always be able to prove that you are right. I will conclude by quoting some of your observations with the cognition of negative emotions. One, in myself, I have observed that negative emotions stimulate into unusual activity eyes of an unpleasant nature, suspicion, feelings of not being valued highly enough, resentment, etc., making one abnormally sensitive to the possible meanings of another person's words, intonations, emphasis, glances, hesitations, and so on. To some extent, such negative emotions are indirectly cognitive, but not likely to be accurate. 2, spiteful eyes, for instance, can be extraordinarily clever at finding just the right thing to say that will hurt. If we could be half as clever as they are in finding our ordinary life contacts just the right things to say, we should make a very different thing of these contacts and connections. But negative emotions are not cognitive in relation to one's life as a whole. They're completely blind there. 3, negative emotions like jealousy and hatred can develop a certain cunning and knowledge of people, but merely to advance their own ends. A person who is jealous or hates someone might know a great deal about their victim, perhaps even more than someone who loves mechanically, which is often just a projection of self-love. 4, as long as we're joined to a person by a negative emotion, we cannot possibly know that person. We see him through a distorting medium. I've often noticed that the reluctance I feel in admitting to people I dislike, even such good as I know them to possess. 5, I'm just beginning to see how blind and stupid, but at the same time, how incredibly clever, in a crooked sense, a negative emotional basis can lead one's actions to be. I'm beginning to see that when I start from a negative start point, the crooked lawyers in me can produce easily an apparently very well-reasoned case, which is false from the start to the finish.